In today's video, I'm going to be talking about population theories. I'll be looking at Thomas Malthus, Esther Boserup and Club of Rome. This is for the IGCSE Geography spec, where you need to know the theories that talk about population and resources and the relationship between them for the economic activity specification. So I'm going to start with Thomas Malthus. He was writing his theory back in the 18th century. And he was essentially a pessimist. He's the equivalent of Malthus is like Thanos from the Marvel movies. He essentially had this theory that said that population would grow exponentially, and it would grow faster, therefore, than the food supply, which, as you can see on here, is rising at a very linear rate. So essentially, because population is growing faster than the food supply, it would eventually overtake it. And as soon as we get population higher than food supply, then we are getting issues that relate to that because we get conflict. So when the population outstrips the supply, we lead to war, it can lead to famine, it can lead to disease. These would be the only things that would be able to take the population back down to below the food supply for things to go back in balance. So he had this, concern that if the population got too high, civilization was going to collapse as we know it. However, if we look at Malthus's ideas, there are some kind of issues with it and some kind of criticisms. On my right here is an example of the bar shows the number of people that have been victims of famine since the 1860s, and that red line shows the world population. So what we can see is there's no direct relationship. What Malthus would say is the population went up, the famine victims would go completely up. And if you look since the 1970s, they've consistently been below 4 million. So this kind of suggests that we haven't seen a huge increase in famines in comparison to the population. And so this idea that the population outstripping food supply will lead to huge problems like famine doesn't necessarily match up, and must be other factors that cause famines rather than just food supply. So one of the huge things, the problems with Malthus's theory is we've had huge technological advancements. We've had GM crops, but also irrigation techniques, new farming techniques, which have helped us in that time produce enough food to meet our global needs. We can also do things like produce food in one area of the world and ship it to another. Both of these kind of ideas were not possible in Malthus's time. He wouldn't have been able to predict that, and therefore he wouldn't have been able to see that this was a problem with his theory. Esther Boserup, she had a slightly different theory. She was an optimist and wrote hers in the kind of 60s and 70s in the 20th century. She said that when population and food supply became close to each other, then we would have an innovation moment. So humans would come up with solutions to the problem to solve the food shortage, and as the population increased, the food supply would increase. So the idea of what we talked about before, GM crops, new irrigation techniques, new ways to make our crops more disease resistant, we would come up with them. Her line was that necessity is the mother of invention. When we really need something, we will come up with a solution to solve the problem. So lots of people have said this theory is quite good, but obviously there's criticisms of Boserup as well. So one of the most obvious ones is that some of the innovations that we've actually used to increase our food supply aren't always beneficial in the long term, and so they're not very sustainable. Here's an example of the Amazon rainforest, which has been deforested for cattle farming. We know that if we continue to do that, to meet our food supply, then we will have severe long-term issues on both a regional and global scale, because the Amazon rainforest is so important for the running of our global ecosystem. So this is an example where innovation does improve the food supply, but maybe there are issues surrounding it and they are not always long-term solutions to the problem. The last group I'm going to look at are called the Club of Rome. They were a group of scientists and politicians that were about in the 1970s. Their main point was they argued that at the current growth rates of the world population, and also the kind of way we were consuming resources and producing industrial activity, all of those were incredibly unsustainable. So they said that at those current rates in the 1970s, the Earth would reach the limits of its growth by 2070. After that, what would happen, because these are unsustainable kind of growth patterns, we would see the collapse of society. So population would go down, food supply would go down, industrial activity would go down. An example of this is people have looked at how much resources we have left. So the idea that on here oil could be completely run out by 2050, gas a little bit later than that. Some of those really precious metals like zinc will be done by 2030, because we're not using them sustainably, and therefore we'll run out. It's the same that if we run out of all these food supplies, then our population would therefore decrease because of it. So they said that this would happen. On our map here, we can see that they're saying after 2050 the population starts to go down because of these issues, and the food goes down slightly before that. They said it could be reversed if they start to implement something we call growth regulating processes. This is essentially systems that are being put in place to actually stop these unsustainable patterns. I've used some examples here. That could be using renewable energy sources. It might mean being more efficient with the resources that we actually use. It could actually be reducing the population by putting limits on the number of children, the family planning in certain countries to reduce the amount of people that we actually have using those supplies. So this is an example that we can make change as long as that we put processes in place. There were criticisms of this. They did say that the one-child policy in China was a good idea. We obviously know that that has wide implicating human rights issues, and so there are also criticisms of the Club of Rome and their theories in relation to population and resources.